The wrestling world exploded when Bayley suddenly pulled the plug on her hottest character transformation in years, leaving fans scratching their heads and desperate for answers about what really went down behind the curtain. If you want to stay ahead of all the shocking WWE developments and insider stories that nobody else is talking about, smash that subscribe button right now because you definitely don't want to miss what's coming next. Bayley had finally cracked the code that every wrestler dreams about. After years of struggling to find her footing as a heel, she stumbled upon something magical that connected with audiences in ways nobody predicted. The transformation wasn't just another costume change or a few different moves in the ring. This was a complete overhaul of everything fans thought they knew about the former hugger. She walked differently, talked differently, and carried herself with a confidence that made even her biggest critics sit up and take notice. The gimmick started gaining serious traction on social media platforms where wrestling fans dissect every single detail of their favorite performers. Bayley's new persona was generating millions of views and creating the kind of organic buzz that WWE creative teams spend countless hours trying to manufacture. Twitter threads analyzing her character work stretched into the hundreds of tweets. YouTube channels dedicated entire episodes to breaking down her psychology and in-ring storytelling. The engagement numbers were through the roof, and merchandise sales for her new look started climbing faster than anyone anticipated. WWE management initially seemed thrilled with the direction Bayley was heading. Internal reports suggested that executives were impressed with how she had taken creative input and molded it into something uniquely her own. The character felt fresh and dangerous in a way that women's division desperately needed. She was getting heat from crowds in the best possible way, drawing genuine emotional reactions rather than the silence that kills so many wrestling acts. Television time increased, and she found herself in prominent storyline positions that elevated not just herself but everyone she worked with in the ring. But then something shifted behind the scenes that nobody saw coming. The wheels started coming off this perfectly running machine in ways that didn't make sense to outsiders watching from their couches. Bayley began making subtle changes to her presentation that seemed small at first but signaled something bigger was happening. The edge that made her character so compelling started getting dulled down week after week. Promos that used to crackle with intensity became safer and more predictable. Her entrance music stayed the same, but the attitude she brought to the ramp felt diluted somehow. Wrestlers who worked closely with Bayley during this period started dropping hints in interviews that things weren't as smooth as they appeared on television. One performer mentioned in a podcast that creative plans were changing constantly, sometimes hours before showtime. Another source close to the situation revealed that Bayley was getting pulled in different directions by various people in positions of power who all had conflicting visions for her character. The lack of consistency was making it impossible for her to build any real momentum even though the foundation she had laid was rock solid. The real bombshell dropped when someone from inside WWE's production team leaked information about a meeting that took place between Bayley and several key decision-makers. According to multiple sources who corroborated the story, Bayley walked into that meeting expecting to discuss upcoming storyline directions and walked out knowing her new gimmick was being completely scrapped. The reasons given were vague and corporate, the kind of explanations that don't actually explain anything but signal that minds were already made up before the conversation even started. Television ratings became a major talking point in discussions about Bayley's character. Network executives were scrutinizing every segment and comparing numbers week to week with the intensity of stock traders watching market fluctuations. Some segments featuring Bayley's new persona drew great numbers and kept audiences glued to their screens through commercial breaks. Other segments didn't perform as well, which happens to literally every wrestler in the business regardless of how talented they are. But in this case, the inconsistent ratings gave people who were skeptical about the gimmick ammunition to argue for changes. Sponsorship concerns also entered the conversation in ways that frustrated everyone involved in the creative process. Corporate partners who advertised during WWE programming apparently expressed reservations about certain aspects of Bayley's character presentation. The specifics were never made entirely clear, but the implication was that her edgier persona didn't align with the family-friendly image that certain sponsors wanted associated with their products. This created a tension between what worked for the wrestling audience and what worked for the business side of the operation. Social media reaction to the gimmick became a double-edged sword that ultimately worked against Bayley despite generating tons of engagement. While hardcore wrestling fans absolutely loved what she was doing, a vocal minority complained loudly enough to get the attention of people monitoring online sentiment. These complaints often focused on minor details that didn't matter to the overall success of the character, but they got amplified in reports that landed on the desks of executives who don't necessarily understand wrestling psychology. The loudest voices in the room aren't always the majority, but they can shape decisions when people in charge are looking for reasons to justify their instincts. Bayley herself remained professional throughout the entire situation even as her creative vision was being dismantled piece by piece. She continued showing up early to every event, working hard in the ring, and doing everything asked of her without public complaint. Behind the scenes, though, friends and colleagues noticed the toll this was taking on her mentally and emotionally. Wrestling at the highest level requires complete confidence in your character, and that confidence was being systematically stripped away through no fault of her own performance. The final nail in the coffin came when merchandising projections didn't meet the aggressive targets that had been set by the sales department. It didn't matter that her merchandise was actually selling better than it had in years or that fan response at live events was overwhelmingly positive. The projections had been inflated based on optimistic assumptions, and when reality fell short of those unrealistic expectations, it gave critics within the company more ammunition. The business of wrestling sometimes prioritizes spreadsheets over crowd reactions, and this was one of those unfortunate cases where the numbers on paper mattered more than the energy in arenas. Creative team members who had championed Bayley's new direction found themselves overruled by higher UPS who wanted to play things safer. The philosophy that won out was essentially a return to formula, going back to character elements that were comfortable and familiar even if they weren't generating the same excitement. Innovation always carries risk, and when that risk doesn't produce immediate and overwhelming results, companies often retreat to what they know. Bayley became a casualty of an organizational culture that talks about wanting to take chances but pulls back the moment things get slightly uncomfortable. The transition away from her new gimmick happened gradually rather than all at once, which almost made it worse than a clean break would have been. Fans watching at home could sense something was off but couldn't quite put their finger on exactly what had changed. The character started feeling watered down and directionless, caught between who she had been and who she was supposed to become. This limbo period satisfied nobody and left Bayley in an awkward position where she couldn't fully commit to either version of herself. Locker room morale took a hit as other performers watched what happened to Bayley and drew their own conclusions about creative freedom within the company. Several wrestlers mentioned in interviews that they became more cautious about pitching new ideas after seeing how quickly things could be taken away. The chilling effect spread beyond just Bayley's situation and created an environment where people were less willing to stick their necks out and try something different. Fear of failure became stronger than the desire to innovate. Fan reaction to the abandonment of Bayley's gimmick was swift and brutal toward WWE's decision-making process. Online forums exploded with criticism about how the company constantly undermines its own talent just when they're finding something special. Longtime viewers pointed to this as yet another example of WWE not trusting its performers to connect with audiences organically. The backlash was significant enough that wrestling news websites ran multiple stories analyzing what went wrong and why WWE keeps making the same mistakes over and over again. Bayley's trajectory after the gimmick ended proved all the critics wrong about her ability to draw and connect with audiences. She continued delivering excellent matches and finding ways to stay relevant despite having her creative wings clipped. The fact that she remained over with crowds even after losing the character elements that made her special demonstrated just how much natural talent and charisma she possesses. It also highlighted what could have been if she'd been allowed to fully realize the vision she had for herself. The broader conversation about creative control in WWE got reignited by Bayley's situation in ways that extended far beyond just her individual case. Wrestlers, fans, and industry observers all weighed in on the balance between corporate oversight and performer autonomy. This debate has existed in wrestling for decades, but Bayley's experience brought it back to the forefront with renewed intensity. The fundamental question remains unanswered about who should have final say over character direction when performers have proven they understand what works for them. Financial considerations played a much bigger role in the decision than most fans realize or want to acknowledge. Wrestling is ultimately a business, and decisions get made based on profit margins and revenue streams regardless of artistic merit. The calculus that goes into determining whether to continue with a gimmick involves projections and forecasts that have nothing to do with whether crowds are cheering or booing. Bayley's new character might have been great for her personally and exciting for fans, but if it didn't check certain boxes on corporate spreadsheets, its days were numbered from the start. The timing of when everything fell apart couldn't have been worse for Bayley's career momentum. She was positioned perfectly to move into main event programs and potentially chase championship gold with credibility that her character had earned. All the groundwork had been laid for a sustained push that could have elevated her to the next level of stardom. Instead, the sudden reversal left her treading water and trying to rebuild from a position that wasn't nearly as strong as where she'd been just weeks earlier. Looking back at the entire situation reveals patterns that WWE has repeated countless times with different performers. The cycle always follows similar beats, with a wrestler finding something unique, generating buzz, getting corporate pushback, and eventually having their character homogenized into something less distinct. Bayley's case was particularly frustrating because she did everything right from a performance standpoint but still couldn't overcome the institutional resistance to her creative direction. The legacy of Bayley's aborted gimmick lives on in highlight reels and fan discussions about what could have been. Wrestling history is full of these stories about performers who briefly touched greatness before circumstances beyond their control intervened. She handled the disappointment with grace and professionalism that earned respect from peers and fans alike. The experience didn't break her spirit or diminish her love for the business, which says everything about her character both in and out of the ring. If you enjoyed diving deep into this story and want more exclusive wrestling content that goes beyond surface-level coverage, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we're bringing you the real stories behind your favorite performers every single week.